Hi, everybody. Welcome to part 2 of Perry Johnson Registrar of Food Safety's Basics of GMP. My name is Brett McMillen. I'm the Cannabis and Hemp Division Manager for the Perry Johnson Companies. And looks like we're having a little technical difficulty. Stone, if you can advance the slide for me. There we go. For those of you that are tuning in for the first time, last week we went over the basics of our Cannabis and Hemp GMP certification program. And for those of you that are not familiar with the Perry Johnson Companies, we are a part of a family of companies under the Perry Johnson umbrella. We're a global certification body for all major ISO standards, including food safety, cannabis and hemp, and all other major ISO manufacturing types. Last week we talked about just kind of an overall basic viewpoint of good manufacturing practices, what's going on in the industry, and the importance of food safety in the cannabis and hemp space and why it's so important. Today in part 2, we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the actual requirements from our checklist, from the standard. We're not going to go line by line. We're not going to get into every part of the checklist, but we're going to go over a majority of the facets of GMP and what those 5 classic points of GMP are. And those are your premises, your people, your products, and your procedures and your processes. We put those together because a lot of those have crossover in terms of your procedures, your paperwork, things of that nature. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. In terms of your premises, when you're considering good manufacturing practices, there's quite a few things that come into play that we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into. Things like security. Are you walking around the outside of your building? Are you keeping an eye on pest control and trash? Who's doing those checks? All right, do you have video in place? A lot of these are state requirements for cannabis and hemp facilities, and also simply for food type manufacturing facilities. But specifically for cannabis and hemp, these come into play pretty importantly. What's going on in the inside of your building in terms of your entries, your employee flow? What are you doing with visitors? Who's signing in? How are you handling environmental monitoring plans? What testing labs are you working with? Are you doing swabs and periodic testing for things like E. coli, salmonella, listeria? How are you receiving products and ingredients? What's happening at the doors, the garages, where people are coming into your building? And how are you handling things like your shipping and your warehouse? Specific to our checklist, in terms of premises, obviously there's a lot of wording here. We don't need to read it line by line, but there's some pretty good points to consider overall, considering your building on the inside and the outside. How are you working with your floors, your walls, your ceilings? Are you keeping them clean? Are you having leaks from pipes, condensation, things of that nature? What's the overall construction of your building? And how are you dealing with those things to make sure you're not getting contamination into your product, slippery floors that could cause injuries to your employees, things of that nature. Something as simple as lighting. I've been to a lot of facilities and we've been on a lot of audits where something as simple as lighting can be a corrective action, to where closets or hallways don't have proper lighting, where you may not even be able to see what's going on correctly. Also, HVAC, ventilation. How are you handling these types of scenarios so that you're not adding to problems that can happen like mold or odors, dust, and different vapors? And also, how are you dealing with the walls, the doors, the overhead doors? Can they be pest proof, right? Obviously, people need to come in and out of the building. Do you have mouse traps, rat traps, where those doors are going up and down? Specifically with your warehouse, when you have folks coming to your warehouse to drop off deliveries, it could be specific THC ingredients, it could be food ingredients, things for products that you're making. It could be something as simple as office supplies being delivered. There needs to be procedures in place for how you're receiving those things, how you're inspecting them, and how you're making sure that the person delivering them and the vehicle that they came in are safe, are clean, and it's being documented so it's not causing an issue within your facility. Obviously, not all deliveries are the same, not all ingredients are the same, but when it comes to manufacturing products, especially if you're making certain types of edibles or cookies, brownies, things of that nature, are you having eggs delivered? Things that need to be stored in a facility in a situation where the temperature is critical, you need to know what those temperatures are, and you need to be able to show how you're tracking those temperatures. Sanitation, also a very important thing within the premises and also for your products as one of the tenets for GMP. Do you have a sanitation protocol in place? Do you have a sanitation program? Who's doing the sanitation in what areas? This comes up a lot as a corrective action in audits that folks are keeping their facilities clean, but they're not really documenting it. How do you know that Fred mopped the floors on Monday? How often does he mop the floors? What are the chemicals being used? Where are those chemicals being stored? Are they being stored in a secure way that's protected from where product is being made so that bleach and other chemicals aren't being contaminated into where product is being made? How are you training people to do the sanitation, and how often is it being done, and can you document that? These are very important yet basic things that happen in GMP audits. Environmental monitoring, this comes up quite a bit, a little bit of a deeper dive into the science, but a lot of facilities when they first start will team up with their testing lab that they have a contract with for testing their cannabis or their hemp product to also do a sampling plan or an environmental plan within their building. Have you done swabs or done testing for E. coli, salmonella, listeria? How do you know that the stainless steel countertops you're using are clean? Even though you have a sanitation protocol and a sanitation plan in place, having an environmental monitoring plan is critical, because if there's a recall or a problem with a product or a customer has gotten sick, you can show that you've done an environmental plan, that you've done environmental testing, and that you've kept records of those tests and how often they're done and what those results are. You may have one area of your facility that's testing clean. You may have another area that's had some problems, and that can help dictate what those problems are and how you can keep your environment clean. Again, document what you do what you document, and a good testing lab should be able to work with you on a lot of the microbial tests that need to be done, not just for your product, but for your environment. Pest control, another simple thing, but a very important thing, and a lot of it gets overlooked. Not in the sense that pest control isn't being done and that it's not important, but it's not being documented. And again, this is something that comes up for us as a corrective action quite a bit. There are a lot of private third-party companies out there that are hired to do pest control at facilities, and they may come in on a regular basis. But those third parties, they need to be licensed by the state. They also need to be recognized by the state as a competent entity that can come in and do this. You don't have to have a private third party do your pest control. We have a lot of clients that do pest control themselves internally and may buy the rat traps or the mouse traps. And the important thing to remember too with pest control is documenting how often you're checking the mouse traps. Maybe you're getting mice, maybe you're getting rats in certain areas, but you're not getting those types of rodents in other areas. You remember that you need to have consistent placement of these mouse traps around your facility, especially where doors are being opened, garage doors are going up and down. certain types of ventilation openings. We all know that rodents can get in and out of all kinds of locations, and it's important to have a good pest control management system in place. In terms of the premises, are you walking the outside of your building? Are there places where the outside of the building needs to be sealed? That includes getting up on the roof. Are you walking around and keeping weeds and vegetation at bay? Is there standing water where mosquitoes and other insects can breed and get into your facility? These are all things that need to be documented and need to be done on a consistent basis so that you can keep your environment safe and clean inside your facility. Okay, another tenet, foundational part of good manufacturing practices are your people. Critical part to any business. But specific to good manufacturing practices, how are you training and onboarding folks? What are your procedures? Do you have an onboarding team? Do you have written documentation? Do you have certain types of training that they have to go through? Different people, different employees are doing different things in your facility. So how are you qualifying them? Different states have different requirements for how you upload that person into your system, into the state system, just for security to know who is coming into your facility. How are you handling visitors coming into your facility? Are you really documenting what time they were there? Are they filling out a visitor information sheet? Are you making that visitor wear a hairnet? Are you making them cover up their shoes? Things of that nature, so you know who's in your building and how you're handling that security. How are you promoting folks on your team? If somebody is doing a great job and now they're going to be handling possibly an extraction machine, or they're going to be handling more responsibility for edibles, things of that nature. How are you training them and how are you showing that they're ready for that new responsibility? What is your philosophy? What is your philosophy with your employees? What is your teamwork like? How often are you having meetings with your employees, with the teams within your building? Not everybody's on the sanitation crew. Not everybody's on the pest control crew. Not everybody is necessarily on the manufacturing crew. So those different divisions, those different groups of people, they need to be able to meet, they need to be able to review what the situations are and how to make things better. How do you handle somebody being sick? That comes up a lot in some of our audits also. Obviously people are sick, but how do you document that somebody's missing, that somebody called in sick? How do you know it's time for them to come back? Also, with your training of your employees, things like jewelry come into play. False fingernails and jewelry, nose rings, earrings, dangling necklaces, things that can get into the manufacturing process. Do you have procedures in place for that? What about their clothing? Obviously, you can't wear flip-flops around the manufacturing floor. Different types of belts, different types of shirts and tank tops. Having these procedures in place for your employees can really limit what happens in the manufacturing place. Also, security. I put water bottles here, and we've talked about this in previous webinars and previous presentations that we've done. How are you keeping an eye and how are you trusting your employees? We had a situation with a grow operation in Michigan that I'm not going to mention, where there were actually blind spots in the cameras, and during the trimming procedures, the trim team had water bottles, Yeti bottles in place, and they were empty. And the team was actually stealing flour, putting it in their Yeti bottles, and walking out with it every day. So we all know, Yeti bottles can hold quite a bit of volume. And each day there was a crew of 10 to 12 people that were walking out with upwards of 12 ounces of product each day. So how are you handling the security of your own employees, and how are you keeping that video? How are you keeping that security safe? Again, these are direct requirements from the GMP checklist that we have. Do you have a dress code for your employees? For visitors and vendors, who's coming into your facility? What types of shoes and clothing are they wearing? These seem like common sense items, but a lot of times the common sense is there. People are being told what to do, but there's not actually documentation in place. Like I mentioned before, hair restraints, hair scrunchies, false fingernails, jewelry, piercings and bracelets, watches. These are all things that can easily be a problem during the manufacturing process. Obviously, are folks washing their hands? What types of sanitation situations are you doing? People coming in and out of certain rooms, taking a smoke break. Another item is, are the signs up for people to actually wash their hands? Where are those hand washing stations? How is sanitation being dealt with relative to the people at your location? Obviously, you're not going to have a break room right next to a manufacturing portion. So when folks are eating and drinking, again, using tobacco products, do you have actual areas for that? And are folks being held to those standards when they come back into the facility before they go back into a manufacturing area? Okay, products. This is a big chunk of today's review and a little bit of a deeper dive into the GMP requirements. With products, there's a lot of different angles to this that are included in the checklist. And this is more food safety 101, but it also comes into play specifically with cannabis and hemp products. Do you have an allergen management program in place? This is a big one. The raw ingredients, the lubricants and the machinery, the finished goods. How are you tracking the ingredients that contain allergens? How are you identifying them? Are you keeping them somewhere so there's not cross-contamination? And what kind of controls do you have in place? Depending on what you're manufacturing and how you're doing it, you may be manufacturing some sort of a dosed baked good like a cookie or a brownie. What types of allergens are going into those products and what kinds of sanitation controls do you have in place to make sure that those items aren't being cross-contaminated? Also, are you doing awareness and control training, at least on an annual basis, with your employees and with your team to make sure those situations aren't happening? Again, with products, do you have certificates of analysis for your ingredients, especially with if you're a manufacturer but you're not doing extraction? Are you bringing in THC oil to make your products? How do you know that that oil or those ingredients coming in are safe? And do you have a certificate of analysis from those vendors? Are you keeping that on file? Are you meeting the requirements of the state? On a side note, I wanted to put in here, in 2004, the FDA did pass the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act. And that means that manufacturers are required to label food packaging if their foods contain one of the 8 most common food allergens. A lot of these don't come into play necessarily with cannabis and hemp, but for discussion purposes, the big 8 are milk, eggs, fish, shellfish, tree nuts, peanuts, wheat, and soybeans. So, peanuts, peanut oil, different types of tree nuts, almonds, milk and eggs are coming into play with chocolates and different types of edibles. These are things that need to be reviewed and your ingredients need to be documented, and you need to make a good faith effort to keep those in the correct places within your manufacturing facility. Again, with products, big thing that comes up, recalls. We talked about this in our first part 1, basics of GMP certification. Let's do a little bit of a deeper dive into recalls. Number 1, do you have a recall plan? How did you even find out that there could be a recall? Did somebody call you and say that they got sick? Was there a recall based on maybe a state representative doing a secret shopper test out of a dispensary and found something wrong with how the packaging was done, how the labeling was done. Maybe it failed a test for some kind of microbial. Maybe there was something posted on social media that somebody found something within a bag of gummies. Anything can happen. How are you going to handle the recall? Who is in charge? Who is your recall team? Who is going to be on point to figure out how that recall happened? How are you going to track your lots and identify where those batches went? What dispensaries are they at? Which regulators? What are those chain of command and chain of events that need to happen to identify the recall and put the recall behind you to move on to save your brand and save your products? When you have that recall in place, what are your disposal procedures? How do you track that you've received all those recalled items back, that you've disposed of them in a way that can be documented, that you can prove to the state you've dealt with those recalls correctly? So a mock recall is a very important thing to do, at least on an annual basis, and maybe even on a surprise basis with your team, almost like a fire drill. How would you deal with that? How fast can you deal with it? How fast can you keep the public safe? In terms of processes and procedures, which a lot of folks will say standard operating procedures or your paperwork, are you being consistent? Are you documenting everything that happens at your company? How do you document these things? How do you keep it simple? Are you using spreadsheets? Do you have a software system in place? How secure is your system in terms of cybersecurity? One of our other divisions, Perry Johnson Lab Accreditation, we just had a cannabis lab in another state that literally just got hacked, and they had to buy their way out to get back into their LIM system for all of their testing, for all of their certificates of analysis. And it was a very, very deep dive they had to go, and it cost them a lot of money. How secure is your software? Who are your vendors that you're working with? Do they have things in place? Also, for cybersecurity, who is allowed to log into your systems? How are you tracking that? Not everybody needs to have passwords and code words into certain parts of your computer system. How are you tracking that? Also, physically at your location, who's going in and out of certain doors? Who's going in and out of certain manufacturing areas? Does everybody need to get into where the extraction is? Does everybody need to get into where the manufacturing is? How are you allowing certain people to get certain access to certain areas? And again, who is in charge of what? Who is in charge of putting those procedures in place? How often are you having meetings with your teams? Are you doing an internal audit to the full GMP standard? Are you having management reviews as an entire company? And are you reviewing those different divisions? How's your sanitation team doing? What have the trends been this year? Pest control, security. These are the things that need to be reviewed at least on an annual basis and can be done as part of an internal audit. And again, process documentation, especially with the products that you're making. The whole point of good manufacturing practices is to keep this in place. Specific for the cannabis industry and THC being infused into different products, how are you tracking the weights, the concentrations, the strengths, the descriptions of the packaging? These are all things that need to be documented. A lot of different software companies and vendors out there can make this quite easy. How are you testing your product, right? Are you using a laboratory that's accredited to ISO 17025? How are you tracking those test results for purity, for possible contaminants? How are you making sure that the ingredients that you have coming into your facility are clean? Do those have certificates of analysis or COAs in the industry? So what are the work instructions for that? Do you have procedures in place? And what are the appropriate quality control operations to make sure that your products, the food, if you will, is good for human consumption, that the product packaging materials are safe, and also meet state requirements. We talked about this earlier in part one for dealing with children. Obviously, kids out there today, if they see a gummy, they're going to think it's candy. They're probably going to eat it. Are your packaging requirements for things like gummies, are you meeting the child-proof, child-safe packaging requirements? Are you labeling things correctly? Are you making sure that the state rules for your edibles make sure that it's not going to be something that a child could confuse as a piece of candy? It doesn't look like a piece of, a Hershey bar, or it doesn't look like a bear-shaped gummy, things of that nature. Product testing concerns. This slide came up also in our first discussion, but it's also very important to remember. How are you handling the sampling of your product? What is the frequency of the testing that you're doing? Is your lab accredited to ISO 17025? Some of you out there are very familiar with this concept and this ISO requirement and this ISO standard. For those of you that are not, ISO 17025 is the most globally recognized testing standard that any lab can be accredited to. So regardless of what state you're in, most likely the testing lab that you're teamed up with has to be accredited to this standard. And this standard requires the lab to show their competency as a testing lab. Are their methods validated, repeatable, traceable? Are they meeting the requirements of the methods and what different industry associations and programs have out there for different types of methods? Are you meeting all the state requirements for what needs to happen? And more importantly, the ingredients that you're bringing in, especially COAs on THC oil, full spectrum, broad spectrum, things of that nature, has that lab and has that vendor given you a certificate of analysis for what we call a full panel, right? Pesticides, heavy metals, pathogens, microbials, yeast and molds, terpenes. Can you show that your ingredients have these tests in place? And can you show that you've done this sequentially with your own product before it goes out to dispensaries, before it gets into the metric system and meets the different requirements that the state has in place? Again, cannabis packaging, another very important part of GMP certification. We mentioned child-resistant packaging can't be a shape or color that a kid would think it's a piece of candy, and that can even still happen even doing your best to try and do this. And that's really up to the customer. Once it's at the dispensary level, the person buying it, the customer, they need to make sure they're keeping their gummies or their edibles or their product safe and out of the way of children. What is the THC level of the product? What is the name and address of where it was made? What is the date of the testing? Different states have different requirements for the labels, but as a producer, these are things that you should have on your label anyway, especially with allergens, especially if it's a chocolate item, maybe a baked good like a cookie or a brownie, things of that nature. Need to have those things on the label. So all these things that we've talked about are part of our GMP certification program. It's part of our accredited, ANSI-accredited Cannabis and Hemp GMP program. And so how do you become certified? What are these different standards? So the Perry Johnson Cannabis GMP standard, it is applicable for cannabis and hemp growers. It's accredited by ANSI. That means that somebody has come in to accredit and audit our program and our own procedures in how we issue a certificate to you. How do we know and how do they know that you're being issued a certificate by a legitimate company? Our standard is based off of existing federal and food industry requirements and the Code of Federal Regulations. I'm not going to get in too deep on federal regulations. We kind of went over that in the part 1, which you can get off of our website. Also, there's different state-specific requirements which are included. So you're always going to get our, what we would call a harmonized GMP certificate from us, regardless of what state you're in. And then if the state that you're in has specific requirements above and beyond GMP, we will review those with you. We will make those part of the audit, and we will notate that on your specific GMP certificate. Typically what happens is different states have different requirements for how leftover product can be disposed, how certain employees are being trained, things of that nature. How can you be ready for an audit? We went over this a bit in part 1, but it's always something good to review, especially in part 2. And coming into part 3 later in December, we're going to have some folks on our panel to do an even deeper dive into this. But after you've reviewed our GMP checklist, you've gotten on board with your company, with your team, with your people, it's important to do a pre-assessment or an internal audit of yourself to know that you're meeting the requirements of the checklist. And if you're not, be honest with yourself about what you need to implement and what those corrective actions are, especially with training your employees. Once you've gone through this, you're absolutely ready for a GMP audit. The important thing to remember too is that this isn't necessarily a pass-fail scenario unless the company is just doing something really traumatic or out of line. Most GMP certifications go well, but there are corrective actions in place that need to be dealt with. And once they're dealt with in writing and a corrective action plan is in place, your certification body can review that as being acceptable and issue your certificate to you. What are the benefits of GMP certification? We discussed these at previous webinars and previous presentations. Obviously, you're going to mitigate risk to public health and safety. You're going to be able to promote your products with confidence, that you're manufacturing things in a GMP certified facility, and that your product line has been reviewed in a GMP audit. Your consumers are going to be confident that they're buying product that's made through a GMP certified facility and a GMP certified company. Certain dispensaries, other multi-state operators are now requiring all of their vendors to have GMP certification so that the full chain of custody of all products can be under the GMP tenets and GMP certification. Another big thing is that your chances are you're going to reduce your odds of a recall, which is going to save you money. It's going to save damage to your brand. And if there ends up being some kind of a litigious situation, a lawsuit, possible situation with your state regulators, you can show that you're putting forth a good faith effort by maintaining a GMP certified facility. Also, a lot of insurance companies, bigger players in the industry, leverage that GMP certification or ISO certification, be proud of that, and leverage that with your insurance companies when you're negotiating what your annual costs are for product liability and also physical insurance at your building for itself. Again, just to kind of wrap things up, 10 golden rules of GMP that we've spoken about. If you're a brand new operator or you're starting from scratch with a fresh new facility, get your facility design right from the start. Understand the flow of your employees coming into the facility, how ingredients and product is coming into the facility. Where is it being stored? How is it getting out the door to dispensaries and to your customers? Validate your processes. How do you validate things? You validate them through repetition. You validate them through going through internal audits and validate how all these things work with mock recalls. Know that you have good procedures and follow them, keeping good records, training and developing your staff, keeping good hygiene, which we spoke about in terms of your employees. And good hygiene, although that you hear hygiene and you think of humans and washing hands and things like that. I would argue that hygiene also gets into your facilities, your environmental monitoring plan, and keeping quality into the whole product life cycle. And again, performing regular audits. A GMP certification is typically once a year to renew that certification. So what happens during the rest of the year? It's up to you, the producer, to make sure that you're doing regular audits and owning the fact that you have a GMP program in place. If you go to our website at pjrfsi.com, you can download all of our GMP checklists and our standards, and we'd be happy to speak with you about any portion of this in terms of strategy for implementation, what the costs are, the timing, what it takes to become GMP certified. And that wraps up our part 2, folks, of good manufacturing practices certification for the cannabis industry. We took a little bit of deeper dive here for part 2, and part 3 coming up in December. We're going to have an exciting panel to wrap up parts 1 and 2 and end the year on a good note to talk about GMP certification, what we've seen in the industry, and what's going to be happening in 2024. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. Again, I'm Brett McMillen, Cannabis and Hemp Division Manager for the Perry Johnson Companies. If you have any questions, please go to our website, or you can email me directly at bmcmillan@pjrfsi.com. Thanks again.